with your illustrious teacher. And while they're exiting, would you turn in your Bibles to the 3rd chapter of Ruth? It's been a couple of weeks since we've been here. 3, I think, exactly. So, scene 3. We'll read the whole chapter. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note that the place where he is lying, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down in the middle of the night. And in the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character." You might want to underscore that. "Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And she said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." And when she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." There's quite a change between chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 2, what do we see? We see God sovereignly leading Ruth to the field of Boaz. She has no prior knowledge of this man. She simply goes out to glean in order to provide for her and her mother-in-law, and she just happens to land in the field Boaz owned. And it just so happened that Boaz was a potential kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer is the next of kin who is to marry the widow. So she is a widow, and there are no brothers to redeem her. Normally it would be a brother. He would marry his brother's widow and so provide for her and also keep the family line going. In this case, they're distant relatives, Boaz and this other unknown person, and they can buy the field that Naomi owns or once owned with Elimelech, and in doing so they take Ruth as wife, and then Naomi too would dwell within the home. So they redeem them, if you will, out of their poverty, and they give them security and so forth. Here in chapter 3, we see 2 women taking action. We see a plan that goes into motion. And since God has provided for Naomi and Ruth, both with food and the prospect of a kinsman redeemer, Naomi devises a plan to find a husband, Boaz hopefully, for Ruth. So simply put, having experienced God's leading, they by faith follow his lead with a plan. Some people think that divine providence and human responsibility are incongruent, but there is no incongruency. They work together. God is all sovereign, and we are to also be responsible with our lives. When it comes to salvation, a choice must be made. Salvation is of God. I know all about election, but that doesn't rule out human responsibility. Therefore, a decision for Jesus Christ determines heaven or hell. When it comes to sanctification, the life of holiness, or our walk with God, we bear a responsibility. And when it comes to life decisions, we are equally involved, as is God. We're to pray, and then we're to get up and do something. And then we are to pray while we are doing. As God leads, we are to responsibly follow. Most of you know that our son-in-law Ben and Allison are going to be stationed in Germany, Frankfurt, for 3 years. He's just finished his 4th year, and they gave him a new assignment for 2 years. By the way, you don't automatically re-up. You have to be chosen to do that. And he and Allison had decided that if this happened, that they would take another 2 years. Now it's going to be 3. And why? Well, they chose to have children. And so that means mama doesn't work and they're living on one salary, and they have accepted that. Well, he accepted this new experimental assignment where men and women are working together in the infantry out in California. Maybe some of you saw it on 60 Minutes. But he also just threw his name into a hat for this assignment in Germany. He says, Alice, it's a long shot, but if God would give us 3 more years, we could be where we need to be financially, and then the plan is to get out and to go to seminary on the GI Bill and eventually enter ministry. They only pick 4. He says, it's a long shot, it'll never happen. Guess what? It just so happened that Ben got picked. And so they will be going to Germany as of the 1st of July for 3 years. But this is a good thing for them because he will be home much more often than he is now. With all the assignments and so forth and field work, he's gone half the time. Military is not always family friendly. So this is a good thing. And God is leading them, and yet they're the ones who are also planning their futures with God. So there is a time to take action. That's verses 1 through 15. And I'm sorry, the 3 things under there, I didn't put the verses in. That was my mistake. It was the second draft, and I handed it off to Annette, and it got printed. So verses 1 through 5, we see that Naomi comes up with a plan. At the beginning of chapter 2, Naomi is feeling pretty hopeless. She's in a funk. But God was working on her behalf even though she couldn't see it. He brought them back to Bethlehem, house of bread. Yes, it was through brokenness, but they still returned to the land. And the drought is over, and the 2 women return at the time of the barley harvest. So we say, oh, there's going to be food here and so forth. And most importantly, God has provided a potential husband and redeemer for Ruth. When you look at Naomi's plan, you can tell that she has thought it out through and through. She's covered all the details. Ruth is to do all she can to impress Boaz. She is to bathe, dress up. I'm sure she had modest clothing, being as poor as she was, but she was to put on her best clothing, and then she was to wear some perfume. She does everything that a girl does on a date if she wants to impress the guy. Naomi picked the most opportune time, the harvest. After winnowing, in the later afternoon, Boaz will have eaten, and he would have been in a good mood. Do you know what winnowing is? It's just a threshing floor. It's just a flat area, rock, and they throw the grain up in the air, and the hulls fly away because there's this breeze in the afternoon, and the grain sinks. So he's probably out there on some rock winnowing, and then she comes later after he's done. He's eaten and he's drunk and he's not drunk. He's just happy and content, okay? He's done well. Ruth is to wait until Boaz is asleep, and she is to uncover his feet, and then she is to take her lead from Boaz when he awakens. Naomi's plan for Ruth is to propose marriage, okay? That's why she goes there. She wants Boaz to marry her. You think, well, why didn't the guy propose? Well, that's just the way it is, okay? She goes and she proposes to Boaz. Though prayer is not mentioned here, this is not a cold, pragmatic, and calculated plan. The two women are fully aware of God's providential leading, and it was going to be a step of faith. There were some risks, as we will see in the near future. So Ruth agrees. Ruth agrees. Remember the word hesed, loyal love? How God loyally loves people and they loyally love one another. You see it here. God is loyally loving the two women. Naomi is loyally loving Ruth. She wants Ruth to be happily married and provided for. Ruth is loyally loving Naomi because Naomi will live with this couple if they marry. And Boaz is loyally loving Ruth. Ruth carries out the plan, verses 6 through 9. Scene 2 begins with Ruth following every instruction her mother-in-law gave her. And she goes to the place where Boaz had been threshing. She finds Boaz asleep, and he's eaten, and he's, had something to drink, and he is contented. He has made plenty from the grain that he has threshed that day. For a wealthy man, Boaz is totally unpretentious. He could have hired a servant guy to do it. But this rich guy is at the threshing floor doing it himself. What happens next is very interesting, and it's probably raised an eyebrow or two in this room as you have read it in the past. And so scholars have their takes on this, and the most liberal take on it is that Ruth uncovered him. You mean the privates, not just the feet, but all the leg area up to the waist, and then spent the night with him. Some go as far as to say that the barley is payment for her favors. It's crazy. But that's where people will go. That's where people will go. They want to read this generation into the generation back then. You have Boaz. He is an Ish Gabor Hayel. What? A mighty man of valor. He's well known. His reputation is impeccable. You have the same word used here for the woman, where they say, we know that you are a woman of excellent or noble character. You have two people here with great character who are relying upon the Lord. They are God-fearing. So there's always a temptation amongst some to add juicy tidbits that are not there. Now, having said that, what happened? Well, no question that uncovering the feet is often a euphemism for covering or uncovering the legs. Or she might have even taken the cover off that he was under and thrown it off of him. We don't know for sure. But it is a euphemism. I mean, remember Saul, he was relieving himself in, and it says he was covering his feet, and that euphemism is used quite a few times in the Old Testament. And so she might have taken the cover off of him that he was under. We just don't fully know, and so, all the sexual implications and so forth. You know what? They're probably there. They're probably there. She's proposing marriage. What does marriage mean? It means two people come together, they bear children. This guy's a kinsman redeemer. She wants to have children by him and carry on the family line and everything. It's all there. It's all there. But I believe they stayed pure. The word lodge has actually no, or stay here the night, no sexual implications at all. So anyway, she says to Boaz, spread your covering over me, or take the fringe of your covering and spread it over me. Let me find security, rest, and love in you. Care for me as God has cared for me. And let me come under your wings as God has taken me under his. So there's nothing sexual going on here. They're just talking about marriage. Of course, all of the sexual part is, the fullness of marriage is implied. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Two good people agreed to marry, and they stayed pure. What happened that night is no different than now when two people wait until their wedding night. They do the right thing, even though it's all they can think about, all right? Maybe wedding plans, there's a bit of a distraction, but they know what's coming and they're desiring it. And what is wrong with that? It's perfectly good. It's a gift from God. I remember being young, I think maybe early years of college, maybe all the way through college. It's hard to remember anymore. But I remember Jesus' words, in the Sermon on the Mount, that if you've lusted after a woman, it's as good as if you've done it, you've sinned. Okay, you've sinned in your head. And I always wondered if it was wrong to be desiring sex in marriage. But Jesus' context and the context here are very different. He's talking about impure sex, lusting after another woman, adultery, and so forth. The desire, though, to marry and to have relations with somebody is good. It's a God-given thing. So young people, there are times where you don't need to feel so guilty. Okay, if you're desiring these things, I think it's a pretty normal part of life. And I encourage people to wait. Young people and even older people. It just seems like nobody wants to wait anymore these days. But if we wait, we will be happy for the rest of our lives. Now I'm going to change the subject, okay? Aren't you glad? Getting a little uptight? I don't get uptight anymore. I just don't. I used to be when I was young, but I don't. Anyway, for Ruth to go out and do what she did was a big step of faith. Some men could have taken advantage of her. There were others out there threshing. She's walking along in the night. She's a Moabite woman, and she's looking as nice as she was. They could have taken advantage of her. And there's also a chance that Boaz might reject her offer. So to repeat, though prayer is not mentioned, it took faith to do what Ruth did. She, by faith, sought in obedience a kinsman redeemer. Unlike some people, as mentioned in the book of James, chapter 4, who presume their plan is God's plan. I know people like this. They just assume that their plan is God's plan. But what does James say? If God so wills. If God so wills. In his wisdom, in his love, and so forth. Ruth is a very different person. She has a plan, and she entrusts to God every step of the way. Third scene, Boaz accepts the plan. He's elated. He praises Ruth up and down. She could have gone after younger men, whether rich or poor, but she chose to compliment Boaz in choosing him over others. So he takes his outer garment, perhaps it's what he was sleeping under, perhaps it's the garment that he wears, and he takes the fringe and he puts it over her head and places, and then, symbolizing, if you will, that he will marry her and that he will be her shelter. And he in turn will lovingly, loyally love her. To avoid scandal, Ruth stays the night and leaves before daybreak. And as a preview of how Boaz intends to love Ruth, he gives her a bunch of grain to take home to her mother-in-law. If we are aware of God's presence in our lives, and if we are praying at all times, and if we can see God's guiding of us, then practicality and spirituality work together as one. That's the big idea. I'll repeat it a lot. Divine providence and responsibility come together. We want to separate this, because it doesn't logically come together, perfectly come together. And some do. They consult God very little in their arrogance. They just assume that whatever they do is God's will. And others are so spiritually minded that they don't get anything done. You know, you can pray and you can pray and you pray, but someday you just got to get off your knees and do something, or it's not going to get done. There's a thing called sanctified common sense. The plan at Jerusalem, you know, the Jerusalem Council, where they had to make a decision for the church concerning certain Jewish rituals and so forth. It seemed right to all of those who were there. They had this council. They agreed with one another, but they also sensed an agreement from the Holy Spirit. So being responsible by faith reveals God's will. We go out there, we act as responsible people, and as things come to pass, we can say, this is God's will. We're to pray for God's provision, and then we're to go out and get it. When I was in Detroit for 6 months, I lived with a German family, a German Baptist family, and I worked at this machine shop. And the guy was a part of the German Baptist church, so he hired a bunch of German Baptist guys, and some of them weren't. And they all had full German brogues because they were first generation off the boat. And this old guy told me very seriously, he says, you work and you pray. But he said it with a brogue. You work and you pray. Work and pray. I said, that's a pretty simple philosophy of life. Yes, it is. But it's true, isn't it? It's so simple. You know, a simple man telling you a simple philosophy, but it's true. You know, my wife, Alice, had a couple places she could have gone and taught after she got out of college. And one of them was way out there in Arizona somewhere. And we were going through it on a vacation. And she says, Laird, this is one of the places I could have worked. And you look around and you go, she says, now you can see why I didn't pick this place. And she was offered a position in Dallas at a Christian school that would pay very, very little. And she said, well, even though it pays very little, she said, I think I'm going to take it. And so she did. And here's why. Because she knew that there were a lot of Christian men in Dallas and she wanted to get married. That was one of the reasons. It wasn't the only reason. But she said, I mean, what am I going to do? Sit up here in Fulton? Do you know where Fulton, Minnesota is? Way up there, you know, northwestern Minnesota. It's the largest town anywhere, around 1,500 people. You know, on Highway 2. You stay there, you go way out there to Arizona someplace. So she went to Dallas. Why? Because she was going to make herself accessible. Did I ever tell you about my first car? I got my first car was in my last year of college. And I was getting ready to go to seminary, and this guy, it was a 68 Valiant. We're talking a long time. And this was 1978, so it was already 10 years old, and it had a little rust, you know, but the rubber was good, and there was pretty low mileage. Somebody had taken the stick shift off the column and put it on the floor, like trying to make it a hot rod. But, you know, it worked, and so I bought it for $100. And then I had $200 of parts in. I had to put a clutch in. I had to put a head gasket in. It was an old slant six. But I could do all this because I worked at the garage. So for $300, I could have a car. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, I'd like to buy this car. And he said, no. He said, if you really need a car, you should pray that God would provide a car. And I said, I have. I said, has it ever occurred to you that this car is God's provision? You know, well, he couldn't fight me anymore, so he said, go ahead and do it, but you know, I don't agree with this. That car took me from Michigan to Dallas, Dallas to Michigan, Michigan to Dallas, and I drove around that thing for 2 years. It was a great little car, and then I ended up selling it. It was great. When it comes to the Christian life, it's a both and. It is God who works in us, and it is us who work out our salvation. Now, having said this, with taking initiative in everything, there's also a waiting on the Lord, and you can't separate these two, between action and waiting. There is a time for waiting, and this is the latter part of the chapter here. We can do all we can, but God is going to have to provide, you know. So you never stop living by faith. The lot is cast into the lap, but it's every decision is from the Lord, man and God. The lot is cast into our lap. We've got responsibility, but every decision is from the Lord. So says Proverbs 16:33. Naomi, Ruth and Boaz have done all they can do, and now they will have to wait on God. They have seen God lead. They have followed God's lead. The rest is up to him. So Ruth comes home, and Naomi asks, "Are you Mrs. Boaz?" And that's really what it means in so many words. Did you propose, and did Boaz accept? And Ruth said in reply, "No, not yet. There's another relative who is closer, and he has first dibs." So Boaz has to wait. Ruth has to wait. Can you figure